Before conquering Jericho, Joshua had to conquer himself. He was facing a massive challenge, leading the people of Israel after Moses' death. Imagine the weight of that. It wasn't just about replacing a man, it was about taking on the mission God had entrusted to the greatest prophet of that time. Joshua was a servant, an assistant, someone who followed orders, and now he had to give them. The insecurity was real, the fear tangible, but it was in that exact moment that God spoke to him clearly and powerfully. Be strong and courageous. That word wasn't given in a calm setting, but in a time of mourning, confusion, and high expectations. God didn't ignore Joshua's feelings. He acknowledged them and still called him to move forward. Joshua knew the people he now had to lead. They were men and women marked by 40 years in the wilderness, witnesses of miracles, but also of complaints, rebellions, and downfalls. How could he trust they would follow him? How could he lead without Moses by his side? What if he failed? What if God wasn't with him like he had been with Moses? These questions aren't so different from the ones many of us carry in our hearts. Joshua found himself in a moment of crisis where God's calling felt bigger than his ability. But then God gave him a promise that changed everything. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. It wasn't about Joshua's strength, but about God's presence. As the people prepared to cross the Jordan, Joshua knew this step meant more than just geography. It was a spiritual turning point. He was on the edge of a miracle, but also on the edge of war. The crossing wasn't just a change of place, it was the beginning of conquest. Even with the promise, faith, obedience, and courage were still required. Joshua commanded the people to sanctify themselves, for the Lord would do wonders among them the next day. This action shows that Joshua understood something vital. Victory begins before the battle. In the heart, in faith, and in purity before God. It was time to prepare the soul, not just the weapons. When the people finally crossed the Jordan, something extraordinary happened. The waters stopped flowing the moment the priest stepped into the river. Not before, not after, but at the exact step of faith. Joshua witnessed this miracle with his own eyes, and though it confirmed God's presence, it was also a reminder he would need to obey step by step. The God who parted the Red Sea with Moses was now parting the Jordan with Joshua. But Joshua wasn't Moses, and that was something he had to accept. God's calling over his life wasn't meant to be a copy, but a continuation. A new time demanded a new posture. The most emblematic moment of Joshua's journey was still ahead. Jericho, a fortified city with massive walls and seasoned warriors. From a human perspective, victory was impossible. But what God instructed Joshua to do made no natural sense. March around the city for 7 days in silence, and on the 7th day, shout. No sword lifted, no catapults, no military strategy, just radical obedience, and that's exactly what brought the victory. Joshua learned that spiritual battles are often won with strategies that seem like madness. God wanted to show that victory didn't depend on strength, but on faith. On the 7th day, after the 7th lap, the people shouted, and the walls fell. But before the external victory came an internal one. Joshua overcame doubt, the fear of looking foolish, and the temptation to do things his own way. He trusted God to the end, and that faith is what tore down the walls. Many times the walls we face today aren't made of stone, but of unbelief, trauma, shame, and unresolved pasts. Joshua teaches us that consistent obedience, even when it seems crazy, paves the way for miracles. He wasn't just a city conqueror, he was a warrior of faith, someone who chose to believe even when everything seemed against him. After the victory at Jericho, Joshua had no rest. The conquest of the Promised Land would happen battle by battle, decision by decision. And right after a great triumph came a bitter defeat. Ai. A small army overcame the Hebrews. Joshua fell. face down to the ground, confused and anguished, crying out to God for answers. That's when the Lord revealed the cause. There was sin in the camp. Someone had hidden forbidden goods. This was one of Joshua's hardest lessons, realizing that one person's disobedience can affect the fate of many. The leader learned that spiritual victories require purity of heart, and that communion with God must be constant. Joshua then led a time of purification and justice. The people were gathered, and in the presence of God, the truth came to light. Disobedience was confronted, and the people regained their fear of the Lord. Ai was conquered afterward, not just with military strategy, but with repentance and spiritual alignment. Joshua learned that the secret to victory is integrity. Strength without holiness means nothing. That lesson still echoes today. Many of our defeats don't come from a lack of strength, but a lack of obedience. Joshua shows that a true leader corrects the path before moving forward. As the years passed, Joshua aged, but his spirit remained strong. He had conquered much, yet there were still lands left to take. In his heart, he carried the responsibility of keeping the people firm in faith even after his departure. So, in his final days, he gathered the tribes of Israel and gave a speech that would echo for generations. He reminded them of all the Lord had done, from Egypt until now, and then he declared, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." That was the legacy he wanted to leave, not just military victories, but faithfulness. Joshua understood that the true triumph wasn't land, but a heart surrendered to God. The phrase, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," wasn't just a motto for Joshua. It was a lifelong commitment. Even after many battles, victories, and losses, he understood that the greatest challenge wasn't conquering cities, but keeping the people's hearts turned to God. In times of peace and abundance, Joshua knew it was easy for the people to forget the Lord. That's why he never let his guard down. He continued to teach, exhort, and guide with strength, like a true spiritual father. His greatest legacy was showing that faith is not just for difficult times, but for every season of life. Joshua didn't just begin his walk with God, he finished it firm, faithful, and full of reverence. Joshua died with honor. He was buried in the Promised Land, the very same land he had once spied on as a young man full of faith. His name was etched not only in the books, but in people's hearts. He was more than a warrior. He was an obedient servant, the man who faced walls, armies, and even his own people when needed, but never stopped listening to God's voice. Joshua shows us that true leadership is found in dependence on the Lord, that courage is trusting when everything seems uncertain, that faith is walking even when the end of the road isn't visible, and that victory is standing firm until the very end. Crossing the Jordan was only the beginning. Joshua, now leading an entire nation, carried the weight of leadership with every step. He knew the Promised Land would not be handed over without resistance. Canaan was occupied by powerful nations, fortified cities, and ruthless warriors. Even with God's promise, fear could easily creep into the hearts of a people who had wandered the desert for 40 years. But Joshua stood firm. He understood that victory would not come by strength alone, but by obedience to God's voice. In silence, he prayed for direction, while the echo of the Jordan, still fresh in his memory, reminded him that the impossible had already been conquered once. The first concrete challenge was Jericho, an impenetrable city surrounded by tall, thick walls, guarded by trained warriors. From a human perspective, attacking Jericho without proper weapons or military strategy was madness. But God didn't need logic to act. He gave Joshua a command that defied all human understanding: march around the city in silence for 6 days, and on the 7th, shout. Joshua obeyed. Even without knowing the full plan, he trusted God's character. Each step around the walls was an act of faith, each lap a declaration that victory would come not through might, but through obedience. On the seventh day, tension gripped the camp. Jericho's soldiers mocked the Hebrew people, calling them weak and superstitious. But Joshua remained firm. As the sun rose, he gave the order, "March." 7 laps in silence, and then, at the end of the final lap, the shout not of despair but of faith. The sound echoed through the heavens, and Jericho's walls, once thought eternal, collapsed like sand in the wind. It was an undeniable miracle. The people entered the city and won. Joshua did not celebrate his own leadership, but glorified the God who turns faith into victory. To him, each conquest was confirmation. God keeps his promises. After Jericho, Joshua's name echoed powerfully among the tribes of Israel. But glory did not blind him. He knew that victory came not from strategy, but from God's power. Despite conquering a fortified city through a miracle, Joshua remained vigilant, aware of how easily the human heart could be corrupted. Then came the sin of Achan. One man from among the people disobeyed the order not to take any consecrated items from Jericho's spoils. He hid them in his tent, thinking no one would find out. But nothing is hidden from the eyes of God. Israel was defeated in the next battle, and Joshua, bewildered, fell face down on the ground, crying out for answers. It was a moment of brokenness, a wounded leader seeking to understand how one man's sin could defile an entire nation. God revealed to Joshua the hidden sin, and with deep sorrow, the leader had to confront the corruption within the camp. He gathered the people, and under divine guidance, Achan was identified. It wasn't a scene of anger, but of solemnity. Joshua looked at the man who had endangered the entire nation. With a firm voice, yet heavy with sorrow, he ordered the purification of the camp. The consequence was harsh. Achan and his family were executed, and everything tainted was destroyed. It was a brutal reminder that God's holiness does not tolerate disobedience. Joshua felt the weight of that decision like a blade to the soul, but he knew that communion with God was more precious than any life spared by omission. Once the camp was purified, God's blessing returned to Israel. Joshua led the conquest of Ai with wisdom and divine strategy. He didn't just attack, he planned an ambush, showing that God also leads through tactical intelligence. The enemy fell into the trap and was defeated, but Joshua didn't stop there. He knew more battles were ahead, so he built an altar to the Lord, inscribed the law on stones, and read it aloud before all the people. Men, women, children, and foreigners listened. It was a sacred moment where sword and word walked hand in hand. As time passed, Joshua's fame spread across the land. Enemy kings united to fight against Israel, but God continued to grant victory after victory. Joshua witnessed signs, miracles, betrayals, and alliances. He faced 5 kings united in one war and defeated them. He saw the sun stand still over Gibeon because of a prayer, a day like no other in history. Yet despite the conquests, Joshua never let his heart become proud. Each city taken, each king defeated, he returned in honor to God. That young man who once carried Moses' promises was now the living testimony that God never fails. When Joshua awoke that morning, his heart was still beating fast from the vision he had received during the night. It was no mere dream, it was the voice of the living God, speaking to him as it had to Moses. In that vision, Joshua had seen the walls of Jericho fall as if they were dust. Not from the clash of swords, but from the cries of the righteous and their total obedience to God's command. That image was burned into his soul like fire. As he emerged from his tent, the light of dawn touched his face, and his eyes shone with a determination that instilled confidence in the hearts of the people. He knew they were not alone, that the Almighty was marching ahead, opening paths where there had been none. tearing down fortresses that seemed impenetrable. Joshua was no longer just a general. He was now the direct instrument of God's will on earth. Joshua gathered the priests and leaders of the people. In a firm voice, he told them what God had commanded. They would march around Jericho for 6 days, once a day, in absolute silence. On the 7th day, they would march 7 times, and at the end, the priests would blow the trumpets, and the people would shout with all the strength of their souls. To warriors accustomed to bloody battles, this sounded strange, almost absurd, but no one dared to question. The faith they had in Joshua was a reflection of the faith they saw in him toward the Lord. The crowd heard, understood, and accepted, not by human logic, but by obedience to the divine word. The court was filled with a reverent silence. They were about to participate in a miracle. It was no ordinary war. It was a holy war, led by invisible hands. The first march around Jericho was a test of faith. The people walked in silence, the sound of trumpets, the only noise echoing off the walls. The incredulous and arrogant inhabitants of Jericho watched from the top of their towers, laughing and mocking the Israelites. "Do they think they can scare us with music?" they said. But Joshua walked steadily, his face like stone, his gaze turned to the unseen. Every step was a declaration of trust. Every turn was a silent cry of obedience, and the heavens watched. Angels walked invisibly beside the people. What their enemies saw as madness was in fact the preparation of a spiritual earthquake about to destroy the foundations of the fortress. Day after day, the scene was repeated. The sun rose, and the Israelites surrounded the city like silent shadows. But the atmosphere grew ever denser, as if the air itself carried an invisible tension. The hearts within Jericho began to tremble, even though their lips still mocked. Something was changing. On the 7th day, the people awoke before dawn. They prepared with a different solemnity. This time, Joshua didn't need to say much. The anticipation spoke for itself. The people knew this was the day the promise would be revealed. And as they positioned themselves to begin the final march, the sky was covered with heavy clouds, as if God himself were lighting the fire. The silence that hung over the Israelite camp at that dawn was palpable, laden with an almost physical anticipation. The sky, once sprinkled with rosy hues, now dressed itself in a dense gray, foreshadowing the solemnity of that final act. The warriors, their faces marked by the dust of the journey and the intensity of the preceding days, waited at their posts, each heart beating in unison with the slow and measured rhythm of their own steps. The curious liveliness of the first days was gone. In their gazes, fixed on the imposing walls of Jericho that rose like a silent challenge, reflected a mature faith, forged in obedience and unwavering trust in divine promises. The cold morning breeze brushed against their garments, carrying with it the distant echo of final preparations, the adjusting of sandals, the firm grip on spears, the deep breath that precedes a decisive moment. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing the imminence of an event that would transcend human history. Joshua, standing erect like an ancient oak among his people, raised his voice, not in a war cry, but in a solemn and firm tone that echoed through the valley. Each word was laden with the weight of leadership and the certainty of divine promise. His eyes scanned the rows of soldiers, conveying an unwavering calm that contrasted with the palpable anxiety of the moment. He recalled the Lord's command, the seemingly paradoxical strategy entrusted to them. To march in silence, the Ark of the Covenant at the forefront, the priests blowing the ram's horn trumpets, and then, on the 7th day, to circle the city, 7 times before the final signal. His voice resonated with the authority of one who had spoken face to face with the Almighty, and his words were like seeds of faith planted in the hearts of his followers, strengthening them for the ultimate act of obedience. And then the movement began. Slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic, the Ark of the Covenant, shrouded in its mystery and glory, was carried at the forefront, the tangible symbol of divine presence among his people. The priests, in their immaculate white robes, followed closely, their lips pressed against the ram's horns, ready to emit the sound that would seal the city's fate. The warriors, in orderly ranks, marched in sepulchral silence, their synchronized steps echoing softly on the dusty ground. With each circuit around the imposing walls, the tension increased, a knot tightening in the throat of every Israelite. The inhabitants of Jericho, watching from above with a mixture of scorn and apprehension, could not decipher the meaning of that strange procession. To them, it was just a senseless ritual, a demonstration of weakness. Little did they know that each silent step was a powerful act of faith, a silent declaration of trust in the power of an unseen God. The sixth circuit was completed under the same mantle of reverent silence. The sun began to decline on the horizon, tinging the heavy clouds with hues of orange and red, as if the sky itself foreshadowed the imminence of a climax. The tension among the Israelites was almost palpable, an invisible thread that linked each heart in a single expectation. Faith, nurtured by constant obedience, shone in their eyes, a silent certainty that the impossible was about to happen. For the inhabitants of Jericho, entrenched in their arrogance and disbelief, the repetition of that strange ritual only served to reinforce their contempt. They mocked, hurling words of scorn and derisive laughter from the walls, blind to the invisible force that accumulated with each step of that sacred march. They did not realize that the silence of the Israelites was more powerful than any war cry, that their apparent passivity was the manifestation of an unwavering trust in divine power. Then Joshua raised his staff, the same one that had once stretched out over the Red Sea, and his voice echoed, no longer in a silent instruction, but in a powerful shout that cut through the air thick with anticipation. Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. At that instant, the silence that had enveloped them for 7 long days shattered in an overwhelming sonic explosion. Thousands of voices united in a unanimous cry, a shout of faith and triumph that reverberated through the surrounding hills. Simultaneously, the priests blew the ram's horn trumpets with all the strength of their lungs, producing a shrill and supernatural sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bowels of the earth. It was the signal, the culminating moment of their obedience, the total surrender to the divine promise. And then the unthinkable happened. The imposing walls of Jericho, which had withstood countless sieges and centuries of history, began to tremble. It was not a common earthquake, but a deep and supernatural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of creation. Slowly at first, and then with terrifying speed, the massive stones came loose, deep cracks snaking through their structure until, with a deafening roar, the walls collapsed. It was as if an invisible and colossal force had pushed them down, reducing the once impregnable fortress to a mountain of rubble and dust. The ground shook beneath the feet of the Israelites, and a shockwave swept through the air. But amidst the chaos and destruction, there was a silence of admiration and astonishment. The miracle had manifested before their eyes, the tangible proof of the unlimited power of their God. Amidst the dust and rubble, Joshua's command echoed again, clear and firm, "Go up and take the city." And the people of Israel advanced, not with the blind fury of battle, but with the serene conviction of those who had witnessed a miracle. There was no significant resistance. Fear had paralyzed the hearts of the inhabitants of Jericho, and divine protection enveloped the Israelites like an invisible shield. The city, once a symbol of power and security, now lay vulnerable beneath their feet. Fulfilling the Lord's command, they defeated their enemies, but spared Rahab and her family, remembering the promise made to the spies in the name of divine mercy. The victory was not theirs by their own strength or strategy, but a gracious gift from the Most High, a palpable demonstration of his faithfulness to the covenant. And there, in that place of overwhelming victory and the manifestation of God's power, Joshua prostrated himself in worship, and all the people followed him. Their hearts overflowed with gratitude and recognition. They had witnessed firsthand that there is no wall, no matter how high and strong, that can withstand the power of the Lord when his people act in faith and obedience. That day sealed not only the conquest of a city, but the confirmation of the divine promise and the strengthening of the faith of a nation. May this story echo in our hearts today, reminding us that the battles we face are not only physical, but spiritual, and that victory lies in our unwavering trust in him who is able to do infinitely more than we ask or imagine. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this powerful story of faith and obedience. Thank you for showing us that through our trust in you and our willingness to follow your instructions, even when they seem impossible, we can witness your power manifesting in amazing ways. May we learn from the example of Joshua and the people of Israel, always seeking your will and trusting in your perfect timing. Strengthen our faith, Lord, so that we can tear down the walls that rise up in our lives and experience the victory that only you can give. Amen. We hope this story has spoken deeply to your heart and built up your faith. If you were blessed by this message, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Turn on notifications to be alerted about each new upload. Share this story with others who need to hear a word of hope, and leave a like to help us reach more lives. We would love to know how this word spoke to you. Leave your comment below, and if you feel comfortable, share your testimony of how God has been working in your life. Your experience can encourage many other people.